Okay, as I warned you guys before the show, or hopefully it's not too much of a warning, I have a little monologue I want to start with, and then we'll jump into some of the more specific stories. And the subject of the monologue is the Green New Deal, but particularly that the Green New Deal is necessary to address what is called the existential threat of climate change, the existential threat. And you'll hear that term a lot as I'll give some quotes in a second. But first of all, what is the Green New Deal? There's a question about that because you had this resolution in the Senate that nobody supported, but people are still saying, most of the Democratic presidential candidates are still saying, we support a Green New Deal, even though they didn't want to support it in the exact form that it was given. So, what is a Green New Deal? Well, the you can think of it in a couple of ways, but the big headline things are that it involves outlawing most or all of fossil fuel use and then mandating mostly or exclusively renewable use. Those, and usually it's in the form of a giant government project to do this. So it's about outlawing fossil fuel use and mandating renewable energy use, and I should also say at a very rapid pace. So what is the justification for this? Well, the two words that keep coming up over and over and over in a way that is very telling are the words existential and threat. So if you have Bernie Sanders, let's be abundantly clear, climate change is an existential threat to our country and to the entire planet. Joe Biden, climate change is an existential threat to our future. Kamala Harris, first of all, climate change is presenting an existential threat to our nation and the world. Nancy Pelosi, we must face the existential threat of our time, the climate crisis. Cory Booker, climate change is an existential threat. Ocasio-Cortez, climate change is an existential threat if we ignore it, but can be an opportunity if we pursue a Green New Deal. I support the latter. Gillibrand, we should confront the existential threat of climate change. Jay Inslee, climate change is truly an existential threat for everything we hold dear here. And I mean everything. So, what is an existential threat? And does climate change, or more precisely, rising CO2 levels, fit that? So, an existential threat can have a couple of interpretations, but the basic idea is it's at least a threat to our existence as we know it and like it. I think of that as at a minimum. It's saying we exist a certain way, we like existing this way, and this is a threat that's going to destroy that. Either it's going to kill all of us or most of us, or at least it's going to harm our lives in a way that they're almost unrecognizable from what we knew and liked. Now, when one thing to note about this term existential threat is that it's a term that we should be afraid of in two ways. One is we should be afraid of actual existential threats, and there are such things. Certainly, in a military context, there's such a thing as a country can take over or really destroy another country. So that's a kind of thing to be afraid of. And then theoretically, you can imagine, uh, maybe it's possible for us to do something environmentally that would be very, very damaging. Certainly, there are, you can imagine threats from space like that, like a giant meteor. So there's such, it's when we hear existential threat, one thing to be afraid of is there such a thing? But then the other thing to be afraid of, and maybe this is the thing to be more afraid of, is that existential threat is often used as a means to government getting a lot more power, which itself then becomes an existential threat. So often there's a problem or a minor problem or even a significant problem, but that's not really an existential threat. But then people say, oh, there's an existential threat, and our solution is for us to have a lot more power. And then that actually becomes an existential threat. So you can take the case of, we've talked about Venezuela. So just schematically, what does Chavez say? I mean, he's basically saying the existing order is an existential threat, particularly the greedy oil industry. So give me Chavez and this government a lot of power, and then we will solve this existential threat. Well, what has actually happened? Whatever was going wrong in Venezuela before, which was plenty, is dwarfed in comparison to what's going on now, because what happened was he took a set of problems, and there are problems that exist, and then he made them much, much worse by fundamentally by depriving people of freedom, by depriving their economic lives of freedom in particular, to the point where people in the country could no longer freely produce and trade in any meaningful way, and where things like the energy system got shut down. And now we have these stories about millions of people fleeing the country, and the average citizen losing 24 pounds, not in a happy or voluntary way, and having really bad drinking water, and all kinds of other things. So that really was existential damage to Venezuela that would be very, very hard to recover from. And yet it wasn't the thing people were afraid of, wasn't the existential threat. The existential threat was actually the cure to the claimed existential threat. And I think you see this all the time in history, where the response to a threat is much worse than the threat itself. So you have, for example, people saying, well, DDT is an existential threat. That's a chemical compound that's used as a pesticide. That's an existential threat to our ecosystem. And then you ban DDT, and then that leads to millions of people dying unnecessarily of malaria. So that happened. You have in all sorts of different socialist examples, people taking over basically every bad regime that we know about having done horrible things. There were always problems before, but then the person made the problems worse by seizing more power. So just one one thing, when people raise the issue of existential threat, yes, I consider the threat that they're talking about, but I'm usually even more afraid of the expansion of government that they're talking about, because that often ends up being the true existential threat. So now let's look at what is the case with rising CO2 levels, because the belief is, well, rising CO2 levels are an existential threat, and therefore that justifies this Green New Deal. And so there are a couple of points about this, but one is that, as is so often the case, um, this Green New Deal is not addressing that alleged threat in any way that makes any kind of sense at all. Because if rising CO2 levels from our existing energy system are a threat, then the question is, what is the most humane way to deal with that threat? Which means, what is the most humane way to uh, lower CO2 levels while still giving as much access to energy as possible? And if we look at the evidence, and in general, the principle needs to be, we want to use every option at our disposal to do this, including things like CO2 capture, including maybe things like geoengineering. But the most obvious slam dunk thing is, use the exactly one type of abundant, reliable power that we know can be affordable and effective on a scale of billions of people. And even if it ends up being more expensive than fossil fuel power, it's at least a doable thing. That's nuclear power. And yet, what does the Green New Deal do? Does it say we're going to use all options at our disposal? No, it doesn't say that. It says we're only going to use one option at our disposal. We want to shut down existing nuclear plants. We want to outlaw new nuclear energy. So the most promising thing, the thing that has actually worked to some extent, at least in terms of electricity generation, with places like France and I think Sweden significantly lowering their CO2 emissions, we're going to actually further criminalize and outlaw that. And then we're going to mandate one particular type of technology, renewable energy, which in practice means almost all solar, wind, and batteries. Although all of them are just completely built using fossil fuels. Certainly the batteries are. Uh, but we're going to mandate these, even though they have this uh, common sense attribute and track record of being unable to deliver abundant, reliable power, because they are not reliable fuels. And this is just a common sense thing, but it's something that nothing has overcome. And as we've talked about on the show before, it's because if you have an unreliable fuel, then you need some form of life support. And this life support can either be a reliable fuel or it can be a battery. But for the batteries to provide true life support, you would need batteries that were 100 plus times cheaper than batteries are today. Because if you tried it today to back up just one day of the global energy supply, would be $100 trillion, which is more than everyone in the world and every business in the world makes in terms of money. So you've got this thing where this has the classic signs of using an alleged existential threat to impose an agenda that's going to do little or nothing about that threat, but then cause enormous other problems. So it's a giveaway that they're not simply trying to find the most efficient way to deal with this threat. They've come up with the most with just the most inefficient way of dealing with this alleged threat imaginable. So that's so far we have that whenever someone raises an existential threat, we have to be afraid of the existential threat that might arise from the deprivation of freedom. And then in this case, their their denial not only of fossil fuel freedom but of nuclear freedom illustrates that their true concern is not actually addressing the threat that they're talking about. But now let's talk about, is this actually an existential threat? And the basis of arguing that rising CO2 levels is a threat are that, remember, an existential threat is a threat to life as we know it. It's saying that life as we know it depends on a safe and stable climate. And the idea is we're endangering that safe and stable climate by changing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from 0.03%, which was allegedly perfect, to 0.04%. And then it's heading upward slowly, but still upward toward 0.05%. And the idea is, well, life as we know it depends on the safe and stable climate, and including a safe and stable level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the problem with this is completely untrue, because we've had with the safe and stable level of CO2 we've had in the atmosphere for a long time, almost all of that time, life was really, really awful. I mean, if just you look at the hockey stick graphs that we show sometimes of life, you have for for thousands of years, life expectancy is 30, income is basically non-existent. The planet can only support, a billion people or less, and just everything is bad for most people. So life, the planet that we live on, we talk about the planet is so nice, but the planet is a very high threat place to live. It's threatening us all the time, and it's a very low resource place to live. We have very little in terms of usable resources. And part of that is a big part of the threat is climate related. The climate is not safe and stable. It's very dynamic and dangerous, and lots of people die because either the climate they're actively hurt by climate danger, or the climate isn't doing what they want. It's not giving them the weather that they want, and they're super at the mercy of climate. And we have data, even through the early 1930s, you have many years where millions of people around the world are dying just from climate related causes. So just from things like storms and flood and heat and cold, leaving aside just dying of general poverty, when things like infant mortality and lack of food, lack of medical care, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea that our existence as we know it depends on some perfect climate situation is definitely not true. The climate by itself leads to an existence, just by itself gives us an existence that is very unpleasant. So in reality, what makes our existence as we know it possible today? Well, what made our existence great was not the friendliness of nature, which has never existed, but the empowerment of human beings. And the key attribute that we acquired is we acquired a transformative capability over nature. So we could transform the threats in nature in such a way as we could neutralize them. So we could take a storm and we could figure out, even if we couldn't stop the storm in its origin, we could stop the storm with a sturdy home. or even by fleeing the storm if we really needed to. So we figured out how to transform, and we could take bacteria, and either in our body we could figure out how to neutralize it, or we could neutralize it outside our body through different kinds of sanitation systems. We figured out how to transform the planet, both to deal with threats, but also to create resources, to turn the planet into a place that went from having very small amounts of usable resources to very large amounts. So that's what we did. We acquired a transformative capability. And how did we get that transformative capability? Well, we got that transformative capability through machines. We figured out we were able to design machines that could transform our environment. And then you probably guessed this is coming. Those machines are totally possible only because of processes that can produce plentiful power for those machines. And that's what we really have today. We are empowered by these amazing machines that can do everything we want. I mean, they can grow food, they can protect us from nature, they can cure disease, but they all depend in one form or another on, we can think of it as plentiful power on demand. And that can be in the form of heat on demand. It can be in the form of propulsion on demand, like for vehicles. And then it can, of course, be in the form of electricity on demand. So that is what actually is the root of our existence is abundant, reliable power. We can also call it plentiful power on demand. And thus, when we're talking about proposals, one of the things to really be aware of is, what is this going to do to our ability to have this plentiful power? Because if we don't have plentiful power, then then that is an existential disaster. Then we go back to living very nasty, brutish, short lives. The planet can't support very many people. And this brings us to the Green New Deal. So Green New Deal claims that even though we have all this plentiful power today, there's an existential threat, because by increasing CO2 from 0.03% to 0.04%, we've created warming, which creates certain climate changes, which are going to overwhelm us. And this is a claim, it's something worth looking into, but this is a claim that's been being made for 40 years in one form or another. And it just always proves to be completely exaggerated. And what keeps happening is that they exaggerate the amount of warming, but also, maybe even more importantly, they completely neglect our ability to um, to neutralize any added climate danger by having all of this power. And so what we often on this show, or maybe not on this show, but in our work, cite the statistic of climate related deaths, where the number of people who die from climate related causes keeps going down and down and down. So in the 30s, it was in the millions per year, and now it's in the thousands or sometimes tens of thousands per year. And it's not that nature has given us such a safe climate now, although it doesn't seem to have changed that much in terms of its hostility to us one way or the other. But what we've done is we've made ourselves safe. We've built a very resilient human environment that is progressively climate proof. And that's really what's keeping us safe. So it's simply not true that this byproduct of CO2 emissions that's come from all this abundant, reliable power from fossil fuels is this existential threat. At most, it's a concern that should be watched, and it's a concern that should be addressed. The only legitimate way to address it is by finding other forms of abundant, reliable power that are also affordable to a lot of people. That's the only way to go. So you can do that through pursuing nuclear power. You can do that through maybe figuring out low cost ways of capturing CO2, maybe even ultimately profitable ways of capturing CO2. But you have to figure out a way to, if you're going to be dealing with something on the level of CO2, which is not nearly as significant as access to power, you need to figure out a way to deal with it in a way that doesn't compromise access to power. And then the Green New Deal is unfortunately doing the exact opposite, because by calling this byproduct of CO2 an existential threat and ignoring the fact that the abundant power from fossil fuels is actually an existential resource, they're proposing to outlaw all known and proven processes to produce plentiful power, including the best non-carbon ones, especially nuclear. So this is really the ultimate kind of existential threat, because really there's one this one technology at the core of our existence, which is which are these fossil fuel based processes to produce plentiful power. I know this is a lot of P's, but maybe that'll make it more memorable. But we have these fossil fuel based processes, and those play such an amazingly positive role in our lives. And we have people saying, well, let's outlaw all of those processes. And then on top of that, let's outlaw the most promising non-carbon processes, which are those are still would need a ton of evolution to fulfill the role that fossil fuels are playing. And then let's mandate the least promising, completely unproven, or even often proven bad processes that involve solar and wind. Let's do that. But let's claim the moral high ground since we're dealing with an existential threat. So the summary in terms of existential threat is that fossil fuels, if you look at fossil fuels objectively, if you look at the full impact of fossil fuels, not just its negatives, but also its positives, fossil fuels and fossil fuel power is not an existential threat. It's actually an existential resource. And the threatening that existential resource is the real existential threat. So all of these people, Cory Booker, Gillibrand, Inslee, all of these people, these are exactly like Chavez and everyone else who what they do is they take an issue and then they claim that it's an existential threat, and then they impose and then they expand their own power in a way that's a true existential threat. But this, the existential threat they're talking about in the US is even far greater than what Chavez did in Venezuela, because it would make us worse off, and it would be starting from a place of others being better off. So that's my view. Fossil fuels are not an existential threat; they're an existential resource, and the Green New Deal is an existential threat. Any thoughts from you guys?
I mean, one thing that I've found in looking into the Green New Deal is that it's often like the um how dictatorial it just completely glossed over. I mean, this is declaring more than 10 million jobs just in the oil and gas industry directly. It's declaring, no, we're going to take those away. It's declaring that trillions of dollars in capital in machinery and technologies that people have built up over time with a lot of difficulty and cost, we're going to just destroy the value of that. It's set aside the fact that they also are going to take over healthcare, they're going to change transportation, they're going to change education. It is so I mean, it's hard to overstate the way in which this is an unprecedented change, and really of like an open call for the destruction of wealth that we're facing, and to the point where I think people don't take it seriously. It's, oh well, it's really just uh, it's a bold plan, as they would say. It's more about an aspiration for some amazing future. But in reality, all it amounts to is giving people a lot of power to destroy an enormous amount of wealth by taking away an enormous amount of freedom. And like that should be chilling.
One small observation related to that, which I totally agree with what you said, is it's revealing about the nature of the unreliables, or what people often call the renewables, solar and wind, that they're admitting that they need a complete government takeover to make these things happen. Because you often hear, oh, it's inevitable that solar and wind uh, will take over, but yet they're recognizing, then why don't they just create some sort of market, or just make sure that all of the problems are out of the way for these things to take over? It's because they're not actually working. And you see around the world, you have sometimes where they'll scale it up some, but then they run into these reliability problems, or the subsidies run out, and then they have to scale back. So there is this, they're acting like, oh yeah, this is obviously the best technology, but we need to completely take over the energy industry in order for it to take hold, versus oh no, just let it take hold, let it win quickly, and then as it's producing all of this super cheap energy, then people will increasingly use it. Stefan, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think it has a similar core fallacy as does the precautionary principle, which simply declares, okay, one side is the absolute catastrophe, and the other side is avoiding that catastrophe. So everything we do to avoid that must be something positive, must have a positive value. But in reality, of course, every action and even non-action has consequence, and you have to consider that carefully. So you can't just say we avoid X and that has a positive value. You can also say, oh, by doing so, the way we do it has an even worse catastrophe as a consequence. So there's absolutely no mention and no consideration of that.
One thing that should be taught in the educational system is just the existential threat of statism. Just that is always something to be afraid of, is the government saying that you do not own your life and that we can forbid competition, we can forbid choice, we can deprive you of property rights. That's actually the biggest thing. That even governments violating the rights of their own citizens are even worse than governments doing that in war. And yet all of the fear, there's some fear about war, but the biggest fear is about what will happen if we leave people too free. And then so anything we do to oppose what free people are doing, that's considered a very morally safe position to take.